the Texas we are going to be talking about the Texas Autism Supplement. So there's 11 areas that we need to cover in our short amount of time. So this is just going to be an overview for y'all to kind of see what are those areas that we look at and that we consider, and how does that affect your child, whether you are a parent or a caregiver, or if you're an educator or maybe even an administrator that's sitting in today. So I'm really happy to be here. I love partnering with the ARC of San Antonio. I've done so for, gosh, I don't know, probably at least 14 or 15, probably closer to 20 years now. And I love the work that they do, and I love that they're offering these supports for our community. So let's jump in.
I forgot to record.
Okay, I did hear it say that you were recording. Is it recording, Heather? Okay, we're going to jump in.
We got it. Thank you.
Great. All right, here we go with Understanding the Texas Autism Supplement. So, for some of y'all, because I know we're a huge military town too, and very proud of that, but for some of y'all maybe that are newer to Texas, first of all, welcome to Texas, because you will want to be here forever. But secondly, you were probably going, what is the state autism supplement? Because my state didn't have this. Well, that's true. This is very unique to Texas. Now, I consult all over the nation, and there's lots of different ways that certain areas and considerations are looked at in a child with autism in their IEP. But Texas, several years ago, many, many years ago, decided to form, there was a committee that was formed that determined that a separate supplement should be created for the IEP team to look at critical areas. And back then, when it was first formed, there were actually 7 areas to look at. And the ARC committee looked at those 7 areas, and they determined what needed to be put into the IEP for best practices for a kiddo. And those 7 areas eventually became 11 areas of consideration. So this is unique to Texas, because y'all know us, we like to be unique. So what I want you to think about, though, throughout our training today is that these 11 areas are really more of a checklist, okay? They're not a have-tos. Every single thing has to be done, but every single area needs to be considered. Think about it as a checklist of strategies and a checklist of things to think about during a child's IEP meeting. Even though it is a supplement, which is a standalone document in the paperwork, I don't want you to think of it as a standalone function. It should be areas that are considered that you'll talk about all throughout the ARD meeting, okay? And again, if you're new to Texas, we will frequently say ARD instead of IEP meeting, but they are interchangeable, okay? So as we go through, you're going to say, oh yeah, we kind of talk about that when we talk about the behavior plan, or oh, we talk about that with the transition supplement. Yes, we do. So this supplement should complement the other areas in the ARD committee and not be a completely separate afterthought or standalone. It should really come together and bring all of the components and the discussions of the ARD committee together. So think about it again as like your checklist of considerations. Did we talk about this? Did we address this? Did we make sure to discuss this? Is this a need? And also, it should be very individualized to each student. Okay, it's not a one size fits all. I'm going to talk about some specific areas here in a little bit that I really want you to think about the customization, the individualization for a kiddo. This is my almost 30 years I've devoted my life to working with kiddos on the spectrum, because I always joke that I was 10 when I started. Just kidding. But I love this population. Our kiddos on the spectrum are unique, but they have various needs that are considered, and that's why this supplement came about. If you want a little bit more formal reading, I'm going to give you a link for the actual commissioner's rules. You can look at that at your spare time, whatever that may be, especially if you're an educator or a parent watching this, you're going, I don't have spare time. But I'm going to give you the link anyway. So the strategies that are described through the commissioner's rules, these are, again, should be areas that are not mandated so much as considered. And they're all based on peer-reviewed and research-based practices, which really, that's what we should be doing for all kids. Everything that we do, especially in the educational field, should be peer-reviewed and research-based, good best practices for kids. So these are the 11 areas that we're going to take a look at today in our short amount of time together. Things like extended educational programming, schedules, looking at in-home training, behavior supports, what we call futures planning. And that's a term that some people aren't as familiar with. So I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. Parent training or parent family training, very important area to look at. And then we look at things like what is the staff to student ratio and how does that vary depending on what the child is doing throughout the day? What are the communication supports and interventions that the child is getting? What are the social skills strategies that we need to look at? What kind of training or support does the staff need to fully implement these research-based practices for our kiddos? And then the teaching strategies. So these are our areas. What I've done, again, we're not going to dive into this in the interest of time, but as Heather has stated, this handout will be sent out to you along with the video. And in this, I provided a link for you on these commissioner's rules. It's about a 16-page document, but it goes more in depth. So some of y'all out there that are educators, or maybe you're serving as advocates, or these are the commissioner's rules, and it's good for really just everybody to be familiar with them. So there's a PDF that links to that document table. It's a side-by-side, okay? But this is what the mandate says. The commissioner's rules do not mandate specific programs or services for students with autism, but it requires the committee to consider these strategies, okay? And everything needs to be driven by the art committee, the IEP team, the planning team, everybody coming together. If a strategy is not needed, there should be a statement as to why is it not needed, or if it is needed, where is it addressed? It could be a standalone statement that you type into the art, or it could be, you know, this area of positive behavior supports is addressed through the student's behavior intervention plan and accommodations. Okay, that might be an example, because again, that links back to the IEP. This supplement should link to different parts of the child's IEP. That way we're covering everything for this child. It's a multifaceted approach, okay? It does require personnel to be qualified and trained as far as general aspects of autism, and also things that are very specific to your kiddo. And remember, again, as I've said, a lot of these things might already be included in the kiddo's IEP. So there's a link also to Texas Project First, which has some great information on the autism strategies, or the 11 areas to consider in the supplement. So let's take each of these one by one. Okay, and then I also want to encourage you, if you have a question about a certain one, to put that in the chat, and then we'll address that toward the end. So the first area talks about extended educational programming. Now, this might look like things like ESY, if you've heard that term ESY, or extended school year. This is typically the time when you're having an ARD meeting or an IEP meeting where you might be talking about extended school year. Is there a need? Does the data show that a student might need either extended school year, whatever that might look like, or does the data show that a student might even need extended day? Because they might not be making progress, there might be data to support that there's been regression over a break that could not be recouped. And we look at things that are linked to those IEP goals. What were the behavior goals, the communication, the socialization, and the academic? and self-help, all those things. Um, for example, 100 years ago when I was an autism unit teacher, I taught 3 and 4 years old. I had what used to be called PPCD, which is now ECSC. And I taught 3 and 4 year olds with very significant autism. I had an autism specific unit for very significant students. And a lot of times, students that are age 3 and sometimes 4 go a half a day as part of their programming. But I had a few students that were so significant. And even with that amount of time and things like that, they were still not making progress in that time. So the ARD committee looks at the data and determines, do they need an extended day? Do they need to go a little bit longer? Do they need to look at a full day? Now, those are extreme circumstances, but there are areas that we need to consider that. Same thing with extended school year. We don't just look at, oh, would summer school be good for this kid? It's more that, is this a need for this student? Because we have created these goals, and the student, if they have a lapse in time, a lapse in instruction, a lapse in intervention, are not going to be able to recoup this within that length of time. We don't want to have a student start back in August and we're starting way over. That's not good for the kiddo. That's not good for the family. It's not good for the school. All right, number 2, daily schedules reflecting minimal unstructured time. This is important too. It should be documented in the student's IEP what their schedule looks like. And it doesn't have to be so specific, like 8 o'clock to 8:05, student walked down the hall. 8:05 to 8:10, student hung up their backpack and then sat on the carpet. It doesn't need to be that specific. But what it should indicate in the supplement is, when is the student receiving instruction? When do they have maybe an elective time? When do they have lunch? When do they have recess? Because it should show that there is not downtime. Okay. And there shouldn't be notated downtime in the schedule. Okay. There should be a structured schedule. And you should also think about these questions. What should the child be doing? Who's going to be with that child? And what location will they be in? Will they be in general ed? Will they be in special ed? Will they be in the cafeteria? Will they be outside of with their peers, etc.? This is also an area where we want to address, if there is a change in the daily schedule, how do we support that child, especially if it's documented that a kiddo has a really hard time with change, which unfortunately so many of our kiddos on the spectrum do. They have a hard time with a big change. So this is a great area to document. If there's a change, this is going to be an accommodation we provide. Now, again, this might be an area that's not necessarily written out a whole lot in the supplement. You could write this as a general accommodation in the student's accommodation pages, or even in the PLATH statement, the present levels at the very beginning. It might be under functional, where it says, Anissa struggles when there is a substitute. So we have been providing a social story saying, my teacher is out. I will have a sub today. If I need a break, I can request a break, or I can go see my case manager. Okay, so having some kind of a caveat. What will we do to support this child if there's a change, like a social story? Or the big one, putting the change on the daily schedule. Okay, we can't go outside today, it's raining, we'll do this instead. If it's deemed that the child has a hard time with those changes. Now, you might have a child that says, you know what, I'm okay with this as long as I'm told verbally, just like the rest of the class. Hey guys, I'm sorry, we're not going to have the counselor today. She's out sick, so we're going to do this instead. If you have a child that's okay with that change, if it's a verbal change, that's fine. But this is for students that need those extra supports, because maybe socially and behaviorally, they might have a meltdown when there's a big change. Okay. Giving things like a break card, having an alternate area to go to. Okay. Number 3. This is kind of a big one. 3, and I think it's 6 is the parent training one. So in-home and community-based training, or a viable alternative. So, in-home training is when the committee looks at the needs. It should be very need-based. It should be very evaluation-driven. What are the needs that the student has in the home, and what are some areas that they're not generalizing? And what I mean by generalization is if a kiddo maybe has learned or acquired a skill, especially related to their IEP goal in one area, say at school, but they are not generalizing that skill into the home or community environment, then we might need to look at or consider as a committee in home or community based training. Okay, because especially if the art committee is deemed it's important enough to have an IEP goal about it, then we want to make sure that there's some generalization. Let me give you another example of when I was teaching. If I was doing potty training with my kiddos, which I tended to do a lot of, if I was doing potty training with my kiddos and one of my students became potty trained at school and I had certain structures in place, like a visual schedule for pottying and a reinforcement system and different things like that. And we were seeing some good success. And the parent was saying, Anissa, they're not doing any of this at home. And we're not sure how to implement this. We're not sure kind of how to emulate the same things. This might be an area where we look at in-home training. You might not have to jump automatically to that. It might be a matter of just parent training, but the purpose of in-home training is we take those same supports, those same accommodations, those same strategies, and we try to take those into the other environment and recreate those for the student so that they're following the same pattern of behavior. Okay, so if the student's following a visual schedule of toileting and a reinforcement system, then we want to create that same visual schedule of toileting and reinforcement system, say in the home. Okay, or in a daycare setting or whatever that might look like. Different ways to implement in-home or community-based training could be actual in-home training where there is a trainer that's provided and the child. And this is something, again, that the ARD committee determines how many hours would that look like? What are the visits look like? This is also where it should not be a one size fits all. I consult with districts all over the state, and some of them have just, well, we give everybody this amount or we give everybody this. It really should be customized. Some families only need a few hours and then we've acquired it. And then we want our kids to get back into their regular routine. Other families or other systems might need more support. It should be customized. So again, it could be in-home training with the trainer. It could be community or environment specific training. We see this sometimes. Let me give you a secondary example. If we've got a student, say at high school, that's doing some community-based instruction, maybe they're going out to HEB with their class and doing some shopping and things like that. But again, the family's going, when we do this, the child melts down, they have tantrums, we can't take them places for whatever reason. This might be where we look at things like community or environment specific training, where the trainer might go to HEB with the family, but again, implementing some of those same strategies. Daycare or after school supports, and then what we might call a viable alternative. A viable alternative is one of those kind of weird things that if a family needs a support, or on the flip side, if the district needs support, but it doesn't quite fit into one of these areas, we might call it a viable alternative. It could be that a family is saying, well, my child is doing all these things in their private therapy related to this IEP goal, but at school they're making minimal progress. So I don't understand the disconnect. Well, first of all, it could be a very apples to oranges comparison because the environments are very different. But if we look to see what's happening, why is there such a disconnect besides just environment? We might look at things like parent family training or we might look at a viable alternative. The viable alternative is maybe the staff person communicating with the private therapist, or maybe the private therapist does a recording and the staff person and the teacher, are watching kind of techniques to consider. So that one's just kind of one of those different ones, okay? But it's something that can be talked about if it's deemed a significant need, okay? Positive behavior supports, these are big, and this is an area that really should link back to your students or your child's behavior intervention plan, or also if they have a functional behavior assessment. Okay. Now, not every single student on the spectrum will have an FBA, a functional behavior assessment, or a BIP, but most of them will. Okay. I can't say 100%, but a lot of them will, specifically because autism affects behavior. It doesn't mean every student is aggressive. It doesn't mean every student is having meltdowns. But when you think about behavior, that's a huge term. It could be, is behavior, on task behavior, self-advocacy, requesting help when they need it. All those different areas are behavior. So when we look at positive behavior supports and strategies, we need to look at what are the things that we're using for the student that are best practices, and are we considering those? This is a big area of the 11 considerations, because behavior, again, links back to diagnosis and disability. It's a big part of autism. Okay. Number 5 of the 11 strategies talks about something called futures planning. Now, yes, there is an S there. It's not future planning, it's futures planning. And that's a little bit different. And this doesn't necessarily, this doesn't take the place of transition. This can enhance transition, but it's also for any kid of any age on the spectrum. What we look at is, what are we doing to work toward independence for this child? Futures planning includes things like work skills, but also how they function in the community, things that they do just to build those independence. Okay, building independence. I'm going to give you an example of this here in a little bit. But for our older students, our middle school and high school kiddos, this is a great area to link back and make sure that we've covered all these areas in our transition supplement. So for pre-vocational skills, vocational skills, make sure this links to the transition supplement. Think about that kiddo's hobbies, their interests, their abilities, and what are you wanting for your kiddo in the future? And how are we going to make them more independent? How are we going to empower them how are we going to help them help themselves? So here's an example that you might have in the autism supplement when you look at futures planning. So for example, to teach Johnny independence, the ARD committee has created a task completion goal. And that's where it links back to the IEP. If you've got a student that's got a behavior of task completion, even if they're 4 or 5 years old, that's something that can be impactful all throughout their educational career and then going into a work environment, right? Because we're always going to have a task to complete. So that might be an area that we look at that can still align with considering futures planning. Here's another one. Sarah's learning how to become independent by utilizing a visual schedule. The ARD committee created a classroom or activity transition goal to ensure her success in using her schedule. And again, it would link back to an IEP goal of like, Sarah will check her schedule, blah, blah, blah. Miguel currently receives community-based instruction on his campus. This is for an older student, and enjoys returning books to the library as his class job. The ARD committee will address his interest in library skills at his middle school transition ARD in the spring. So even something as simple as that, where we're showing that we're considering the student's needs, the student's interests, and how their current interests might affect future interests. All right, number 6, here's another big one. Parent family training and support provided by a qualified person. There's a lot of different ways that this might be considered. And again, this is not a given. This is not a guarantee. Yes, everybody needs parent training. This is a consideration. We have to look at, does the family need to be empowered with certain skills necessary for their kiddo to succeed in the home or community setting. It might be things like resources, providing different resources, hooking them up with parent support groups, because those things can be really impactful. I work with so many families, and they say, when they've talked to other families that have kind of been there, done that, it can really give them some great ideas and strategies. Also looking at if in-home training is offered by a trainer that's working with the child. I always kind of encourage looking at parent training too, because we don't want that in-home trainer to be with that kiddo all the time. That's not the purpose. That's not the goal. The goal is for the in-home trainer to go in and empower the student, teach the student, but then kind of pass the torch and teach the parent, this is how you do this with this child. This is how we're doing it at school, or this is how we're doing it in the community. Pass the torch, now it's your turn, and then the trainer backs off. We're empowering the child, but we're also empowering the family so that they take everything over. So here's some examples, because this is an area that we don't just have to traditionally send a trainer to the home to give support. There's so many ways that we can provide parent family training, just like our seminar today that we're doing today to help parents and caregivers and educators better understand the supplement. Think about it could be that if you've got a family that just got the diagnosis of autism, that's a big diagnosis. And some of y'all that have been there, done that, got the t-shirt, you've been in this game for a long time. I bet if you think back to when you first got that diagnosis, it was pretty overwhelming. It was pretty overwhelming. It was pretty daunting. And sometimes just to have a packet of resources, not a big stack of medical information per se, but resources and supports and reassurance. This is where you can go if you need help for your child. This is where you can go if you need help for yourself. This is where you can go if a brother or a sister, a sibling wants some support. Those types of things can be very reassuring. Having books. One of the things, I was a district coordinator for Northside ISD, and I was in charge of our autism program. And I got to brag for a little bit, because we had a huge, and I haven't been there for quite a while. I've been consulting on my own for years, but at that time we had a huge parent resource library where we had videos, DVDs, books that could be checked out. So it could be that if a parent says, I know y'all are doing PECS training with my child and picture exchange for their communication system. I need to know more about that. It might be that we give them a book about PECS, we give them a video about PECS, and then maybe somebody follows through with that and kind of talks through that. It could also be that the parent maybe goes up and observes a session as part of that parent training. But think about when you're looking at super critical areas. And those super critical areas to me fall back in alignment with the diagnosis: social, communication, and behavior. Big areas. It could be that the staff videotapes the student, again, with permission. Make sure you get the proper permissions for these. But it might be that the teacher records the student doing a certain skill or doing a certain whatever, so that the parent can view, like checking the schedule or using their communication book. We used to do a lot of that as well. Sending home materials, hooking parents up with some great resources and websites, which I'm going to give you toward the end of this session today. Some school districts even offer like parent support groups, or they offer trainings a couple of times a year, or maybe quarterly, monthly even. So things like that, looking at things like that. So we've got some wonderful, wonderful resources here in San Antonio, again, through the ARC, through Any Baby Can, through, the Autism Community Network. There's so many wonderful places where we are trying so hard to reach all of our families. And then, of course, the old standby that a trainer can go into the home. All right, number 7. I'm going to go a little faster now. I'm looking at our time. Number 7 is where the ARC committee needs to address what is called a suitable staff to student ratio that's appropriate for that child's needs. Now, this might vary depending on what they're doing. So, for example, you might have a child that's fully included in Gen Ed. So, the staff to student ratio might simply say, the student is able to be successful with the typical staff to student ratio in general education of 1 teacher to 22 students. Or you might say the student is primarily in general ed with 1 teacher to 22 students, but for maybe guided practice or new skills, it might be small group, like 1 teacher to 5. Maybe an inclusion teacher comes in and pulls the student for a small group toward the back for more intensive supports like in reading or in math. So that's where you might document some of those things. Sometimes I would document kind of a range because it depends, areas can grow as far as reading groups and things like that. So you might say the reading group range from 1 to 5 up to 1 to 6, or 1 to 4 up to 1 to 6. And it might be too that a student does really well, but transitions are really hard and they need to have somebody with them during transition. So you might say, well, the student's classroom ratio is 3 adults. Maybe there's a teacher and 2 paraprofessionals. So 3 adults to 10 kids, but for hallway transitions or outside transitions, it's 1 adult to 2 kids. So marking things like that. And the reason we want to document that, and again, I would document it in another area in the ARD2 that says, the student's very successful with classroom transitions within the room, but outside of the room in the hallway, they are needing additional support because of XYZ, safety reasons, whatever, and document that because that justifies the ratio too. Okay. And then just a little side note, I would look to see if there's a safety issue and the student's needing that much support with hallway transitions, I'd probably take it a step further and look at creating a goal to address being more independent during a hallway transition. That would be a goal we'd probably want to work on too as a functional goal. Okay, because we don't want somebody Velcroed to them all the time. We definitely don't. That's not our goal. We want to empower our kids to be more successful doing things for themselves. All right, number 8 is another huge one, communication interventions. This is an area that you will see addressed a lot in the PLAT, the present levels at the very beginning of the ART under that section of communication. And this is an area too that our speech therapy professionals will really talk about, and there will be speech therapy goals if your child qualifies for speech therapy, which again, a lot of our students do, not all of them, but a lot of them. So all of this should complement and marry each other as far as what we talk about with speech and language supports and systems and this area in the Autism Supplement. Social skills. This area in the Autism Supplement wants to know, how are we addressing social skills? Again, this should be something that's talked about throughout the ARD. It might be a section under general accommodations that a student might use, or in even the behavior intervention plan, we might list that the student has, peer models and peer supports, or are they pulled for a small group social skills time? Do they have a social skills goal? Under general accommodations, are you using things like video modeling or social stories or, visual supports and things like that? So just some examples. You can even put something like social skills strategies for the student are listed on the BIP. It might be as simple as that, but then make sure that the ARD committee has addressed social skills strategies on the BIP, the behavior intervention plan. You could take it a step further and be a little more specific. Social skills supports were addressed for Johnny by developing a peer interaction goal on his IEP, but also it's addressed through the FBA and the BIP. Specific strategies are listed on the BIP. Number 10, professional educator and staff support, such as training provided to personnel who work with the kiddo to make sure that techniques and strategies are correctly implemented. This is where we look at staff training. What does the staff need, not in general, but to implement this student's IEP, to implement the accommodations that have been talked about, the goals that have been talked about, and the supports and strategies that are needed for that child to make mastery on that goal. Oops. Okay. So again, this is where and districts, in my opinion, are doing a better job at trying to be proactive and getting behind this for all kids. Seeing if a teacher or paraprofessionals are not having training, what do they need? Are they sending them to training? Are they sending them to conferences? Are they having, maybe it could even be kind of on the job training where a support specialist or an autism person from the district comes in and does some modeling and some coaching and some practicing and shadowing and on the job training and things like that. There's also some wonderful online modules, again, that I'm going to give you guys at the end. I think they're wonderful for parents, for educators, for paraprofessionals, speech therapists, doesn't matter. There's some great free training online that really builds not just how to implement the strategies, but to really understand the autism brain. Once you really understand and get the brain of a child with autism and how they take in information, you have this appreciation after that of how we can kind of take a step back and go, okay, wait a minute, I'm presenting it this way, but I'm thinking the child is not processing it the way that I'm presenting it. So maybe I need to change the way that I'm presenting information. So, and finally, number 11 are teaching strategies. These are the actual strategies that ensure, as a committee and as an educational system for that matter, that we're using peer-reviewed research-based practices. Now, this is where this might encompass a whole lot of different things as far as supports that are based on things like applied behavior analysis or structured teaching principles or augmentative communication, assistive technology, social skills training, and curriculum, all those different things coming together as teaching strategies to support this student based on the IEP goals that y'all have agreed upon and the accommodations that are needed to help that kiddo master the IEP goals. So here are some really good, in my opinion, research and links. I'm going to turn my alarm off because I have a timer on for when to stop so that we can have some questions. But here's some research and links for y'all that you can check out. Of course, I've got the commissioner's rules in there. I've got some videos and things. The texasautism.net, that's toward the bottom, texasautism.net/resources is a fantastic website that gives lots of different visual strategies that you can download for free. It gives online training free, research articles, modeling of strategies. There's so many things in there. It's absolutely phenomenal. So there's just some links for y'all as we continue to learn. I've done this almost 30 years and I'm still learning every single day. And that is my contact information. And I'm going to go ahead and do a stop share so that we have a few minutes to take some questions. I know we went through that quite a bit fast, but there's a lot of things to consider in those 11 considerations. So,
well, this is great information, Anissa. And first, before there's a couple of questions, but before I get into the questions, there was someone that asked if you could just clarify some of the acronyms. So,
yes.
Yeah, some of the acronyms as far as PECS, SLP, ARD, and
Yes.
FBA. Yeah, if you could just maybe clarify what those acronyms stand for, and then we'll get into a couple of questions.
It was PECS, SLP, ARD,
and FBA.
And FBA. Okay, got it. And I apologize for talking an acronym. That's what special educators do, right? So especially those of y'all that maybe are newer parents or things like that, the acronyms I know can be very overwhelming. So I apologize, I went through that quickly. So PEC stands for Picture Exchange Communication System. It is one type of augmentative communication. If it's and it's something that the ARD committee would determine what kind of visual functional communication does that child need. But basically, and I don't think I have something in front of me, but basically, if a student has a binder that has multiple visual supports, I wouldn't use these, but multiple visual supports of things that they want to request or comment on or let a communicative partner know about, that's picture exchange, where they actually take a picture that they want to say, that's their voice, and exchange it with a communicative partner. Okay. Again, that's a communication system that the team would talk about to determine if is that a system that we want to use with this child, and that would be under the guidance and advisement of the next one, the SLP, which is the speech and language pathologist. That's your speech therapist. Okay, so SLP is speech language pathologist, which is the speech therapist for the school district. ARD is Admissions Review and Dismissal Committee. So that's your IEP team. So when I say ARD, that's your meeting, the meeting, when we have the annual meeting. Again, if you're from another state and you're just joining us, I know you got here as fast as you could, got to Texas, but that's your IEP committee team. That's the meeting that you have, that all the meetings of the mind come together for this child, for the benefit of this child, to make some good decisions. And then you would sign off on what those decisions are and implement going forward. FBA. FBA is an assessment. It's the functional behavior assessment. And this is something that a lot of our students have. Again, not every kiddo is going to have an FBA, but a lot of our students do. A functional behavior assessment is conducted at the request of the ARD committee. Okay, so y'all would come together and talk about any challenging behaviors that the kiddo has that are affecting their educational performance. Are they impairing that child's mastery of progress? Are they impeding that child's behavior or the behavior of others? And you would request a functional behavior assessment, and then an assessment would be done to determine how does that child's behavior function. That's why it's called a functional behavior assessment. What's driving that behavior? Are they trying to escape something? Are they trying to get attention for something? Is it a sensory thing? Are they trying to access something and they've been denied something they want? And so that assessment would be done, and then you would come together and determine the findings of that behavior assessment. You would determine what kind of goals, what behavior goals does this kiddo need, and do they need a BIP? I know you didn't mention that one, but I'm going to throw that one in as a gift with purchase. So a BIP is a behavior intervention plan. The behavior intervention plan is, what are we going to do for this child? Now, every child falls under the student code of conduct for every campus, every kiddo. Everybody follows the student code of conduct. But I want you to think about the student code of conduct is what happens to a child. The behavior intervention plan is what happens for a child. How are we going to teach them, if they're doing this behavior, what are we going to teach them to do instead, based on their function? So that's the BIP. I think I covered them
I
all.
think you covered them. Yeah. And then there was just a quick follow-up to that for the ARD.
Yes.
So that's not necessarily across the United States. They may call that ARD something different in other
Yes.
states, or okay.
So the ARD, the Admissions Review and Dismissal Committee, or the ARD committee, that's just an IEP team. It's the IEP meeting. We say ARD in Texas, so that is a Texas thing. Just like this, the 11 areas of the Texas Autism Supplement is a Texas thing. ARD is a Texas thing, but it simply means it's the IEP team. It's the meeting to determine what are we going to do for this kiddo? How are we going to help this kiddo? And it's our legally binding contract. It follows IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It follows the law of the things that we need to look at for a kiddo with a disability. It lists things like the eligibility, the testing, their levels of performance, their current levels of performance, their goals, their behavior plan, all those things.
Great. So this next question, it deals more with graduating diplomas specifically. So the question is, my son is 14 and he is in the 8th grade. He has high functioning autism and ADHD. He has gaps in math and English language arts.
Okay.
They suggest to put him on resources in high school, but if he is on resources, he won't get an academic diploma, which would apply to universities. Any advice?
I think she's talking about, or the family's talking about the track, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
change in the track. I would, so that's going to be a hard question for me to answer without knowing the child and the needs that they have because of the resources that they might need. But what I would encourage is for that family to reach out to the case manager, which is typically the special ed contact person, and actually set up a meeting. It doesn't have to be an ARD meeting or an IEP meeting, but set up an actual meeting. It could be on Zoom or whatever, and talk about the pros and cons and say, I have questions about this. And this is also too, because the child is 14, and this is a great time to be talking about transition and the transition, because this is where we have those conversations with families about what do you see for your child? What are the goals for your child? If you're wanting them to go to college, if that's feasible, if that's realistic, and this is something the child wants to do too, because this is where we really want to get input from that kid. Get those kids involved in their ARD meetings, get them involved. That we want them to go. We want them to advocate. We want them to say, I like this, or this works for me, or this doesn't work for me. Stop doing this. I have to tell a quick story. So I was helping with an ARD a couple of months ago. And this girl was sitting into the ARD, and she's the student with the disability. And they asked her something, and she said, you know what, when y'all talk about that doesn't help me at all. I could care less about that. And we're going, well, then we're not going to do it anymore. Why are we spinning our wheels?
Truth, yeah.
Our kids are, we need to give them
They
more
speak
credit.
the truth. Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
no kidding. So again, if I was that family, I would reach out and have a one-on-one conversation with the case manager, who probably is tracking that student pretty closely, and talk about what the goals are and how this could impact graduation and post-graduation activities.
Yeah, great advice. And also, I'll just throw in that the next session that we're having is Friday, May 21st, and it's on transition. Yes. Lorene Dillard's going to be presenting an local advocate here. So hopefully you can join us on the 21st, and some of that can be discussed at that presentation as well. So, okay, next question. For extended day or extended year, would the year be extended into the summer school, or would they go to school for an extra year, or are both an option?
Typically, it's a consideration from ARD to ARD, from year to year, that you would look at the data, and then you would determine, based on these IEP goals, if the child's not making sufficient progress, or if they were making progress and there was like a break in instruction, like the Christmas break, the Thanksgiving break, spring break, whatever, and they weren't able to recoup, then extended school year would go into the summertime. So there would be that. So the whole purpose of that area is to make sure there's not a huge gap from, end of May, 1st of June, when kids get out of school, till August, because that length of time, if your data, and if the school district data is showing that a kiddo had a 2-week lapse at Christmas and they weren't able to recoup those skills in 2 weeks, then it's really a concern if they're going to have an 8-week lapse or a 9-week lapse over the summer. they're going to have an even much harder time recouping those skills in the fall. So that's why we might look at extended school year going into the summertime. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it might just be for one area. If a student's doing okay academically, but maybe speech and language, they're struggling. Maybe they have a communication device and they're really struggling with that as far as regression, or they're not utilizing it effectively during those breaks. It might be that they just get extended school year in one area. So again, it shouldn't be a one size fits all. It should be real customizable based on the data and the needs of the kiddo.
And when do you suggest parents start talking to the school about extended school year?
Now, if not
Okay.
earlier.
If not even sooner, like even sooner, you would say.
Even sooner, yeah, because when you think about it, that data should already kind of be in.
Right.
Districts are collecting that data. Again, big things. Of course, we're not talking about, if a kiddo has a 3-day weekend and then they come back Monday and they're like, kind of trying to get back into the swing of things. That's typical. Or if a kiddo has a week off at Thanksgiving and it takes them a couple days to get back into the swing of things, that's typical. That's typical for any kiddo, whether they have a disability or not. What we get concerned about is when a teacher tries to get back into that instruction and the kiddo is acting like they didn't retain the information, or they've regressed either behaviorally, communication wise, self-help even. But data should be collected. All that data should already be in based on what was happening over the Thanksgiving break, what was happening over the Christmas break, spring break. All those breaks have already occurred. So that data should already be in.
Right.
So
great.
for any families that are about to have an ARD coming up, ESY should be considered at those ARDs just to be talked about. Hey, was there any regression in skills?
Perfect. Okay, we'll do one more question and then I think we'll be short on time. So this is a toughie. This is a toughie question. And I think, this is something I hear. Get your coffee. Well, it's just in terms of elopement. So what is the best way for the school to address elopement with a child that has autism? What are some strategies that you've seen or used, or
Yes.
and I know that's a big issue with a lot of families. So yes, if you could just address that.
Yes, that's a big issue and definitely something that has to be addressed. So the very first thing I would do is to look to see if the child has a functional behavior assessment, an FBA. What does the FBA say? Does it address elopement? If it addresses elopement, what is the function of that? Because we can't put a strategy in place if we don't know function. So that would be my first thing. For example, if you've got a kiddo that elopes, say they're in the classroom or they're at home, and boom, they take off like a rocket. It might serve 4 different functions, and you're not going to use the same strategies based on that function. If a student, so I used to have a student like this, and I've worked with several other students that have done this. If they go to the door and they have their hand on the door and they're looking at you and they're looking at you and they wait for you to look at them and then they take off, it could be that the function is attention seeking. If they want the chase, they're laughing, they're doing all that, and the function might be attention seeking. So we're going to use a whole different set of strategies for that, such as increasing attention in the room, increasing attention for compliant behavior, for on-task behavior, for staying in the room, than we would for the elopement. It doesn't mean we go, okay, adios, see ya, I'm going to totally ignore it, but we might go and follow the kid for safety reasons without drawing a lot of attention, like, oh my God, no, stop. We're not going to offer that attention carrot that they're wanting. If you've got a student that is eloping for escape purposes, so same behavior, right? Elopement, but if the function's different, if they're escaping for escape, avoidance, say you've provided them something tough to do, or you've given them a directive that they don't want to do, or something is scary to them, or something is confusing to them, or something is painful to them, and they want to take off, then we would use a different set of strategies and behavior supports for that. It might be that every time I give a student something challenging and they elope, maybe I need to look at what I'm presenting. Maybe I need to present less. I need to present easier, and I need to use a visual like a first then, like first do 5 problems, then you can get a break. Um, if they take off and elope for sensory, am I offering enough movement? Am I giving them enough breaks? Are we going outside? Can we do a little bit and then go ahead and have them go outside and run around and walk around and do, it shouldn't just be you get 15 minutes of recess a day and that's it, if that's not what a student needs. So I know that's a little bit longer answer, but it all comes back to whatever the strategy is or whatever the function is for elopement, then you determine what the strategy is. And to really determine function, I would look at a functional behavior assessment. And if the student is eloping at home as well, that's where you might look at parent training as well. And having, sometimes it's nice just to have that outside resource piggybacking with you as a parent, even though our parents are just incredibly crazy knowledgeable and reading and doing all these things and they know their kiddo best. Sometimes it's nice just to have a partner in crime and to have someone piggyback off and say, this is what's happening. Let's go through this together. This is what we're doing at school. Let's try this and go from there.
That's
Strength in
awesome.
numbers.
Yes,
Strength in
yes,
numbers.
ma'am.
We're
All
better
righty.
together.
Well, in the interest of time, I think we're going to need to go ahead and end our webinar. But Anissa, I just thank you again for all of your help and your information and your expertise in this area.
Pleasure. My pleasure.
Yes. And so just a reminder to our attendees that we'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint, the link to the webinar. And if you can just remember that on May 21st, we'll be having our next session on transition with Lorene Dillard. Just in general, if you have a family, if you're an educator or you are a family that needs any kind of assistance with navigation or support, the ARC of San Antonio Family Support Services program is here to help you. So please reach out to us. You can reach out to me through the emails that you receive through Eventbrite and through the Zoom. We just want to thank the Harvey E. Najam Foundation and the Mays Family Foundation for making all of our webinars possible. And so with that, we'll let you all go and enjoy this beautiful drippy day.
We need the rain though.
We need the rain, that's right. So thank you so much, and everybody have a blessed day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.